And while Misha Berach is about healing and wholeness, still I need to share another prayer, a contemporary prayer. O people of conscience, cry out. Cry out against arrogance, cry out against hatred and anger, cry out against violence and oppression. For God requires us to stand in the name of justice and freedom, for God requires us to oppose terror, to muster our power and energy against racist aggression, and to protect all houses of prayer. O God, we implore you, look down upon the suffering perpetrated against churches, mosques, and synagogues, against houses of worship in so many lands, by the hand of wickedness, by the hand of ignorance and sin. Today, we remember with sadness the attacks on Al Noor Mosque and Linwood Mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, and the loss of precious life. With your gentle and loving hand, God of shelter, unite all of your children under your canopy of hope and love. Bring the light of salvation and healing to the four corners of the earth. Amen. We make this transition now, healing and tragedy. We think of people who are struggling, but part of Shabbat and even sharing these prayers is continuing our message of hope. And there is tremendous hope in this community. There's tremendous hope in our world, and we share so often that nobody can take that away from us. And part of how we live out hope is by continuing to learn and to celebrate and have joy and peace and find a sense of being grounded and connected. That's also how we embrace that conviction of hope. So I want to make this transition and to introduce briefly our guest, who's going to be our teacher this Shabbat, both here and at Congregation Bonei Shalom. It is Daniel Matt. And I spent just a little bit of time today and heard for the first time, you really just heard for the first time last night at the lecture with one of our partners with CU, the Jewish Studies program, and the Religious Studies department. And what I learned wasn't just text and understanding of some new way to look at Jewish text or Jewish tradition or ideas, but there was Jewish art in his words. And so I hope we listen to the Torah that he's going to share. But first, let me say a little bit about you, because it's quite extraordinary, actually. So Daniel Matt is really one of the world's leading authorities on Kabbalah and the Zohar. He has published over a dozen books, including the Essential Kabbalah, which is translated into 7 languages, Zohar Annotated and Explained, God and the Big Bang, discovering harmony between science and spirituality, which was the nature of the talk last night. Recently, he completed an 18-year project. Let me say that again. An 18-year project of translating and annotating the Zohar. In 2016, Stanford University Press published his 9th volume of the Zohar Pritzker edition, concluding the Zohar's main commentary on the Torah. And for this work, Daniel has been honored with a National Jewish Book Award and a Koret Jewish Book Award. The Koret Award called his translation a monumental contribution to the history of Jewish thought. For 20 years, he has been a professor at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He's taught at Stanford and Hebrew University of Jerusalem, small little institutions, and is still in Berkeley. And we are all just delighted that you are here, and we're excited to learn with you. So please come and join us. Friends, this is going to be the opportunity to take out this handout that you received. It says Shabbat, Israel, and Shekhinah on the top. And at some point, you might hear a little bit from it.
Thank you for the warm welcome. It's wonderful to be here in Boulder over Shabbat. And I want to share with you some teachings about the Jewish mystical tradition. I really want to dedicate my teaching this evening to the memory of the innocent, our sisters and brothers from the Muslim faith who were killed on the Islamic Sabbath, and someone who tried to ruin the tranquility of Shabbat and was somewhat successful. We have to make sure that the tranquility of Shabbat is preserved. And I think there are two ways that we can combat that specific evil. One is to reach out to our sisters and brothers of other faiths, and specifically the Islamic faith. And the other is to recommit ourselves to the beauty and profound meaning of Shabbat. You know, there would be no such thing as the weekend if it weren't for Shabbat. Shabbat is really one of the greatest gifts of the Jewish people to the world. And what is celebrated all around the world and what is taken as a great break from the normal mundane activity, it would not exist if it weren't for that commandment to keep the Sabbath. So it's something very precious that we received as the Jewish people and that we have shared with the world, and it's something we can commit ourselves to preserving and spreading. I'm just going to speak very briefly at the service. I'm going to speak a little more at length later tonight and tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon and tomorrow night. But now I just want to speak very briefly about this amazing ritual, this amazing service that we just engaged in. And it's interesting, you might say it's a coincidence. I'm speaking about Kabbalah, and the service that we are in the midst of praying is called Kabbalat Shabbat, the Kabbalah of Shabbat. Now you might say that's just a coincidence. After all, the word Kabbalah means literally receiving or welcoming. And the reason the Friday night service is called Kabbalat Shabbat is that we're welcoming the Sabbath. It really has nothing to do with Kabbalah, but that's not true because it has everything to do with Kabbalah. Because in fact, the whole service that we pray, the whole first part of the service, culminating in that beautiful hymn, Lecha Dodi, that never existed in Judaism until the Kabbalah. So you really could say Kabbalat Shabbat, the service of welcoming the Sabbath, is a Kabbalistic invention. It was created by the Kabbalah. Now, of course, the normal evening service was instituted by the rabbis of the Talmudic time, long before the Kabbalah. But the whole first part of the service and that beautiful ritual where we stand up and turn to greet the Sabbath Queen, that was invented by the Kabbalah, specifically by the Kabbalists in Sfat, in that beautiful mountaintop city, that other beautiful mountaintop city in the Galilee, known as Tzfat, Safed. So I want to share with you a few teachings. I think all of you have this. If you don't, you're sitting next to someone who does. And we're just going to look at a few passages. The first one is a beautiful teaching from the Midrash on Genesis. If you know some Hebrew, you can follow along in the Hebrew, but we'll read the English. Rabbi Shimon, son of Yochai, taught, Shabbat said to the Blessed Holy One, Master of the universe, everyone else has a partner, but I have no one. This is at the end of the first week of creation. Okay, Sabbath is about to begin, and Sabbath complains to God. Sunday has Monday, Tuesday has Wednesday, Thursday has Friday, but I'm all alone. The Blessed Holy One replied, the assembly of Israel is your partner. So we are wedded to the Sabbath from the beginning of creation in order that she won't be lonely, and maybe in order that we won't be lonely, we are joined to the Shabbat. And when Israel stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, to receive the Torah, the Blessed Holy One said to them, remember what I said to Shabbat. The assembly of Israel is your partner. Remember the Sabbath day, lekadesho, to sanctify it. But that word can also mean to marry it, because the word kiddushin refers to marriage. So when God commanded Israel to sanctify the Sabbath, according to Rabbi Shimon, that command was really to marry the Sabbath. It's up to us to marry the Shabbat. And then you have an interesting account in the Talmud, number 2, two rabbis who invented a certain way of greeting the Sabbath. Rabbi Hanina would wrap himself in a garment and stand at sunset on Sabbath Eve and exclaim, come, let us go out to greet Sabbath the Queen. Okay, this, of course, reminds us of Lecha Dodi. I said that Lecha Dodi was invented by the Kabbalists, but as with most things in Kabbalah, there is an earlier kernel. There is an earlier root, and it's exactly this. One rabbi said, come, let us go greet Sabbath the queen. So already in rabbinic times, the Sabbath was pictured as a queen, and the Kabbalists just took that and ran with it. They developed it into a full-blown ritual of Kabbalat Shabbat. His colleague, Rabbi Yanai, would put on his special clothes on Sabbath Eve and exclaim, "Come, O bride, come, O bride." Bo'i kala, bo'i kala, you can see in the Hebrew. And that, of course, entered the Lachadodi. Okay, we'll turn the page, and here we have one verse from Lachadodi. We have the refrain, which is chanted between every verse, Lachadodi likrat kala, come, my friend, to greet the bride, Pnei Shabbat nikabala, let us welcome Shabbat. Literally, the face of Shabbat, let us receive. Let us welcome the face or the presence of the Sabbath. So that is the refrain that is sung before and after each verse. But look at this last verse. This is what will show us what's unique, what's new about the Kabbalistic understanding of Shabbat. Come in peace, crown of her husband. In joy, too, and jubilation. In the midst of the faithful of the precious nation, come, O bride, come, O bride. So what does this mean? We know that the Sabbath is a queen or a bride, but we thought that we are married to the Sabbath. That's what Rabbi Shimon said. God said to the Sabbath, Israel will be your partner. But here there's something else going on, because look, we have a few characters involved here. One is the Sabbath, who is the bride. Now, who is the husband? Because the husband can't be Israel, because then it says, come in the midst of the faithful of the precious nation. So the nation is Israel. The husband is actually the masculine half of God. And the Sabbath is pictured as the feminine half of God. This is one of the radical innovations of the Kabbalah, to picture God as equally male and female. We'll talk about this a little more later. But the Sabbath is a symbol of the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is the divine presence. And according to Kabbalah, there is a marriage that happens every Friday night between the feminine half of God and the masculine half of God. So we're celebrating that wedding by saying, Shabbat, who is the Shekhinah, she is the crown of her husband. She is the crown of the Holy One, blessed be He. There's a divine marriage. Now, we somehow participate in that marriage. You might say we are the best man or the best woman, but in a sense, we marry ourselves to Shabbat. You might say we marry ourselves to God. We participate somehow in that mystical union. I know that's a little hard to wrap our heads around, just kind of dropping a seed now, and we'll talk about it more tonight and tomorrow. I want to conclude with number 4 and 5. Look at number 4. We now have an opportunity to observe the Sabbath by turning off anything that's intruding, any busyness in our mind, any busyness in our pocket. This number 4 begins with a quotation from Genesis. God blessed the seventh day. Okay, Vayavarech Elohim et Yom HaShvi'i. God blessed the seventh day, and one rabbi said he blessed it with the light of a person's face. The light of a person's face all week long cannot be compared to how it is on Shabbat. Somehow when we allow ourselves to slow down, when we allow ourselves to rest, to taste the tranquility of Shabbat, it has an effect on how we look. It has an effect on how we smile. It's easier to smile on Shabbat, but it's easier to smile when you put away the busyness of the week, when there are no more conference calls to rooms full of lawyers, when there are no more appointments. Right? Shabbat is a day to just forget our normal busyness, our normal activities, and our face is actually changed by that experience of letting go. Now what's remarkable, and I want to conclude with this, look at number 5. Number 5 takes us back to a line in Lachadodi, Pnei Shabbat Nikabala. Let us welcome Shabbat. But look again at the literal meaning. I mentioned this a moment ago. Literally, it means the face of Shabbat we will receive. Now, you could say that means the presence of Shabbat we will welcome. But in line with what we just read, you could read it more literally. The face of Shabbat, there's a new face, and we should be willing, be able to accept that, to receive that. We should receive the possibility of smiling a little bit more easily as the Shabbat begins. Shabbat Shalom.